pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth, man mastered the mammoth and horse. Man was the Lord.
What is the best Manowar album? I mean, let's be honest, right? It's probably Into Glory Ride, wouldn't you say? I mean, if you take away Return of the Warlord, which, to be honest, I found a little bit annoying, then the rest of it has to be the greatest epic metal album of all time, right? I mean, it has to be. Well, that's for another podcast. This one is going to be a bit about politics, a little bit about politics. So if you'd rather hear about, well, quite frankly, which one is the best Manowar album, then that's going to have to be for another week, perhaps next week. Anyway, this one's going to be a little bit about politics. So maybe keep the image of Manowar 1983 in their loincloths, oiled, muscular, young, virile, and ready. Keep that in your mind as you listen to me discuss, where did the term gaslighting came from, and the movie Death of Stalin and a few other things. All right, let's get into it. Agitators Anonymous. I'm Alan Averill. Welcome to episode 200 and, I don't know, what is it, 210, 211? Who knows? I should have given this up by now, shouldn't I really, and got myself a real job. As if, hardly likely. Patreon.com/Alan Averill. You can go over there and become a patron. There's all sorts of things happening. There's discussions about movies, about books. There's other songs. Well, I mean, demos of songs, all sorts of other things like that. There are no tiers because I can't quite figure it out. This is my own incompetence. And seeing as I'm about to talk about politics, that's pretty apt, to be honest, because it's just an avalanche of incompetence. Not a bad name for a progressive metal band, that, is it? Huh. Anyway, right. You can go over there. You can follow me on Nemthiang_Primordial on Instagram. It's not that exciting, I must admit. And Primordial_official if you want to go and follow Primordial. By the way, this is not the Primordial podcast. This is the Alan Averill podcast. Every now and again, I have to make that distinction when somebody gets a bit irritated at some of my opinions. I had a really nice insult for my recent podcast about democracy. I think I called it Celebrity for the Ugly. And someone who just posts pictures of their food said my podcast was trite nonsense. There you go. That's the world we live in. But anyway, I hope you enjoy this one. You can add it to you. Maybe you can have it as an hors d'oeuvre, or maybe you can have it as a dessert to whatever meal you might be having that day. A side salad of bitterness, so to speak. The show is as ever sponsored by Metal Blade Records, 40 years of independence. You can follow the links underneath to indiemerch.com/metalblade. And you can get 10% off your order. We also have some pretty cool Primordial shirts available lately. Go and follow us on Instagram to go and have a look at them. We Shall Not Serve shirts. One of my favourites off the last album. It's got a whiff of the first album about it. Somehow reminds me a little bit of a kind of Fuil Arsa on steroids. Fuil Arsa being the first song on the very first Primordial album. Marfia Wilga Joe, Gurkul Timple Acrunia, nor Dea de Ursa, nor Dita Fosa Lossa. Yeah, there you go. A little bit of Irish for you. Always stuck in my brain. Of course, it has my odd enunciation, my odd pronunciation, which was the source of much mirth back in 1994. Anyway, if you've ever seen the movie The Death of Stalin, if you haven't, I would really advise it. A movie I feel that maybe would have been a bit more of a hit in another era. It's, I think, written by Armando Iannucci, who's behind the brilliant political series The Thick of It, along with many other things. I think he was involved in Brass Eye. If you don't know Brass Eye, it was a kind of satirical political show that was back in I think it was the late 90s, the early 2000s. I'm not sure it could be made today, but it was absolutely cutting. But go and have a look at that Brass Eye. But anyway, The Thick of It, I think, was the movie, or Thick of It was the show. In the Loop could be the movie. It's about, I suppose, it's supposed to be based on English politics during the Alistair Campbell Blair years. And, obviously, if you listen to The Rest is History, which is, I do actually listen to it. And apparently it's become one of the biggest podcasts in recent times as regards, well, I suppose the fact is an awful lot of people just don't read the news anymore. They get their politics and they get their opinions from podcasts. I certainly listen to the Rory Smith, Alistair Campbell, as much as I dislike some of his opinions. And we'll get to some of those. And because it's been quite an incredible week in politics. But I digress, as is my wont. But it's written by Armando Iannucci. It has some Monty Python alumni in it. I think Michael Palin is in it. The Death of Stalin. I'm back to talking about what I'm talking about. It might have been more of a hit in another era, but kind of, I think, went over the current very low bar set by modern cinema. There's a framed copy of Pravda on my wall here for no particular reason. Doesn't betray any political allegiance of mine, but I was looking at it the other day and it got me thinking. In fact, I bought it because it had a cool kind of picture of a guy with a sword on the front of it. One of the first times I ever visited Prague, and I think it's from like 1958 or something like that. But I think I've actually mentioned it on the podcast already, actually. If I have, forgive me. I tell the same stories over and over. And as I get older, probably more and more. And my oldest friends will attest to the fact. But I think that's just what we do. It's the law of diminishing returns when it comes to the firing of our synapses. Seeing as this is a sort of an episode of elections and politics in the last week in politics, and maybe a kind of mental hangover from the US election debate last week. If you didn't watch it, I watched it, so you don't have to. And now I'm going to talk about it. And of course, the UK election is tonight, which really seems to be sort of apathy mixed with disgust at how incompetent the Conservatives have been. I mean, are they really even Conservative anymore? You could argue not. Given the biggest mandate under Boris Johnson in 2019, they would appear to have squandered all of that. Could you even call them, as I said, Conservative anymore? And like rats jumping from a sinking ship, I think over 70 of them have handed in their notice so far. Add to that the spanking that favourite compliant son of the banking system, Emmanuel Macron, got in France. And one could say it's been a tumultuous week in politics. Of course, this all follows on from the US election debate, which I'm going to kind of talk about, sort of, and try and connect two movies in a sort of smart arse kind of way. But that's what you're here for, right? But most people are so weary and wary of it. Oh, I trust. Well, I don't need to trust. You can sense this. People are just so weary of everything. And trust in these institutions is at an all-time low. No one believes any of it anymore. It all seems performative. It feels like, especially lockdown and people's experience of the last 4 or 5 years has really just pulled the curtain aside. And the actors on the stage, the politicians, the political class, the elite class, it's like they've just gone, well, fine, you pull back the curtain. We're going to get on, we're doing anyway, because there's nothing you can do about it. And it got me thinking about how damn Soviet some of it felt. I don't know if you know the plot of the Death of Stalin. Well, it kind of goes a bit like this. And it's based, of course, roughly based on the death of Stalin. Because when Stalin was found dead in his dacha, his woodland retreat outside of Moscow, I think it's 1953, the system aparchiks or whatever that word is, around him, the top generals and brass in the Communist Party weren't really sure what to do. In fact, he lay there for quite a long time before anyone had the guts to even try and move him, set in motion a whole series of tumultuous events which they knew would follow if he really was dead. But anyway, so the movie kind of goes a bit like this. On the night of March 1953, Joseph Stalin, he calls the director of Radio Moscow. And apparently this was something he often did. He demands a recording of the live recital of Mozart's Piano Concerto number 23. Except for the fact that they hadn't been recording that particular performance. So the conductor, the director, obviously not wanting to anger Stalin, as you could find yourself in a gulag pretty quick, has to, recall all the musicians back onto the stage of the half-empty auditorium. And I think he has to fetch a new conductor to replace the original one, who has fainted. And they have to do the whole thing again, except for the fact that one of the pianists, she refuses to perform. She's, decided to dig her heels in and say no to the dictator. But I guess, echoing real life, is persuaded to do so by the simple fact and knowledge that if she doesn't, it's going to have serious repercussions for not only her, but her family and everyone who's standing on the stage, sweating it out, waiting for her to want to play. So that's kind of how the movie opens, i.e. a whole lot of people having to rush around behind the scenes to fabricate a recording they'd managed to make a mistake in not recording originally, and please, obviously, Stalin. At the time, Stalin is having something of a hoo-ha gathering of the NKVD, and that that he reveals he's going to get rid of Molotov, and he's talking to Beria, a really, really rotten man, this Beria chap, and as well in history as well, not just in the movie, a pretty nasty piece of work. However, when the recording of the performance arrives, this pianist, who has, tried to resist everything, has managed to put a note inside which basically expresses her, expresses her dissatisfaction, but hardly that, saying that she basically wishes his death. Stalin reads it, suffers a brain aneurysm or whatever it is, and despite all of the rest of them who are arguing, hearing him fall, Stalin's guards, fearful of being punished for disturbing him, don't enter his office. Now, this, of course, is not actually true. This is not exactly what happened. He wasn't, sort of put to death by the cerebral reaction to a letter from some, pianist in an orchestra. But, of course, he did die. And his housemaid the next day discovers him unconscious. So the members of the Central Committee each learn about his death and sort of rush to the dacha. This is less the movie now, and this is more kind of in real life, really, to be honest. What follows in the movie then is kind of really, I suppose, a sort of a dark comedy, a sort of a spy story, a dark comedy, as all the members of the NKVD. You've got Beria, you've got Khrushchev, Zhukov is there, and they all kind of are vying for power. They're all backstabbing each other. There's purges. 1,500 people who come to a funeral are killed. It's really quite an amazing movie, and it has this incredible feel somehow. Like the colours are very strange, very interesting. It all feels like very darkly lit. It feels almost as if when you look at those old communist propaganda posters, it has an awful lot of a feel of that to the movie. I'm not quite sure how to explain that properly. Beria ends up getting satisfyingly shot in the head in the movie. Like I said, a nasty piece of work. The movie sort of concludes with the hero of the story, the Maria, the soloist, the pianist, performing again the same concerto at the end. And Khrushchev, who triumphed the first time around in the kind of shake-up after Stalin's death and becomes the new head of the Soviet Union, is watching, but Brezhnev, who will succeed him, eyes him from his seat. It's a brilliant movie, and one I would entirely recommend. I've sort of butchered the explanation of the movie there. I watched it only a couple of weeks ago, so that's kind of like a sort of what's left of my memory from it, trying to get the whole thing across there. Get the whole thing across there. Brilliant language. So the point being, anyway, one of the strongest and I suppose most nefarious affliction, I think that was one of the first two Primordial songs ever written when we were called Forsaken. Nefarious Affliction and Prince of the Sky. Yes, indeed. 1991. Was it August or September 1991? I don't know. Sounds a bit like Autopsy meets Medieval Prophecy or something like that. Anyway, I digress, of course. But one of the most nefarious building blocks of the Soviet regime, I guess, was the ability of the state the system to literally, of course, just lie to the people. And everybody went along with the lie. Stalin would say, well, this is what you must tell the people. Everybody knew it was not true. The people, including, knew it was not true. The people writing the stories, Pravda, all of the arms of propaganda, everyone knew these things were just not true. Stalinist purges were infamous. Famously, during World War II, he had purged most of his generals when the Germans advanced. Didn't believe the intelligence coming through, and the army was in total disarray. He bumped off family members. The public were given propaganda to swallow, his inner circle. No one really was powerful enough to tell him the truth, as is often the case with dictators. They're all afraid heads will roll. Now, of course, I'm not going to go on to compare, for example, exactly feeling a little bit Soviet to some of the things happening lately. But there's a hint, there's a smack of it. And I think that also it's something people do, I think, in modern terms with language, is they always rush for the most extreme example. I've seen people, you've seen people on Instagram. I have friends on Instagram who've used the words after the presidential debate, we've got to do everything to stop this dictator. And you're thinking to yourself, well, dictator, in this context, is this the right word? Or is it just the most extreme word that just gets the most eyeballs on the sentence? Because if you follow I think one of the greatest podcasts there is, it's called Dictators, Real Dictators it's called, you begin to realize, if you're living in a Western country right now, listen to me, what a sort of cushy life you've had in the 90s and 2000s, that we've had this window of sort of relative prosperity. Not if you're from the Balkans, perhaps, in the 90s, but most of the West has sort of this window. And now some would say, and argue would say, come on, Brian. Some people would say, of course, that the invasion of Ukraine, what's happening between Israel and Palestine, what could happen with Taiwan, is that we are entering this new Cold War, that the conscription is happening now, or the threatening movement of conscription is happening in some Western countries. They're discussing it in the US, in the UK. You could say that maybe that sort of sunny uplands of upward mobility that most of the West enjoyed during the 90s or 2000s is now over. So we're entering a different dimension. But people often use words such as dictators with sort of careless abandon. They throw it around when in reality, it's not quite like that. Although, of course, I accept, as if you watched my interview with the artist Kim Holm. Again, we got stuck in the weeds over a few descriptions of words, but I always think the truth is in the grey area, that there's the shadow of authoritarianism is... The shadows of authoritarianism can be echoed in the decisions of much of our political class, but to call them actual authoritarians, well, or dictators, let's say. But I get it. I get the impulse. But people within the inner circle are, no one is quite powerful enough to tell people at the top of the pyramid the truth. And this is often, as I said, the case. They're all afraid heads will roll, mainly their own. But this power struggle is evidenced across governments and corporations, local politicians just trying to save their jobs, keep their heads down, or just on the re-election trail. The wishes of the public, be damned, really. But as the Soviet experiment continued, what exemplified the relationship between, for example, the proletariat and the propaganda was, the likes of Pravda telling the public how yields were up, productivity was up. But by the 70s and 80s, as the system was sinking in its own corruption and mismanagement, falling well behind its Western capitalist counterparts, the breadlines grew, babushkas queued for scraps of bread and meat, the cupboards were bare, and yet the papers told a different story. And that's what I mean by kind of like the propagandized arm of the state, just this sort of lies just bilging forth into the public sphere. And everyone knew what was happening. They all knew that they pick up the paper and go, yeah, this is bullshit. So everyone is just invited to take part in this huge lie. It's also fascinating to me when you visit Eastern Europe, and I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe over the years, how infatuated, if you go to a museum, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, or Ukraine or other Eastern European countries, it'll always have the measurements of the machinery, the measurements of the room, the measurements of its output was this many kilowatts, it's that, it's the other. The mathematical obsession with numbers, because this is what the minutiae of the system did. You know, the Soviet system would say, well, we need 17,210 toothbrushes per year. And this is, everything. They tried to micromanage every single want, need. I won't say aspiration, because it certainly was not an aspirational system. But to provide everything that it thought people wanted within the very, very carefully constrained confines of the management of this industrial system. And so the obsession with numbers is just everywhere. The cupboards were bare. Now, of course, it may not be exactly the same thing, but right now, more and more people in supposed rich countries in the West, the UK, the US, I'm sure probably in your country as well, if you're listening to me in Western Europe, are using food banks. They're falling through the cracks of society financially, unable to eat properly, unable to pay rent, and working 2 or 3 jobs. We're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, which of course is blamed on Putin. Putin? Really? Still? For everything? Ukraine is the grain seller of the West, don't you know? I see. Right. But yet, most of these companies, we've seen groceries, we've seen food. Yes, it's a heavy metal podcast. Don't get all grocery on me. They've gone up 4-fold. An energy crisis, yet the energy companies have had the greatest year ever. I looked that up. A viral crisis has given Big Pharma the greatest yields ever. Doesn't it benefit this elite class, this political class, to just have us all in constant crisis? War on several fronts, conscription coming back, like I said, or the talk of it at least. The arms manufacturers' profit margins go through the roof. Of course, we cannot leave Ukraine to the dogs. I had an interesting back and forward about this in the comment section on my YouTube, and it got me thinking that maybe I was being a bit too linear about it. Arms manufacturers, they want forever war, and of course Ukraine fits the bill as the new Afghanistan. I do stick to that opinion, but of course the West cannot abdicate all responsibility in that region, or any region. I'm not an isolationist. But it does feel like we are increasingly weak when considering this new axis: Iran, North Korea, China and Russia. Who are our trusted politicians ready to, march into the breach, or whatever one must say? It just feels like this mistrust between people and institutions of power is entirely justified. People don't trust the media anymore. They feel they've been lied to, because they kind of have. And they've just been asked to go along with it all. And if you, like me, for the first time in the last couple of years, heard the word gaslighting, we hear this all the time. And the term, I looked it up, and the term gaslighting is coined by Ingrid Bergman, it would seem, from a 1938 British play called Gaslight, in which a husband manipulates a wife into thinking she is crazy by slyly changing the intensity of the gas lights in her home when she is left alone. And he does this in an attempt to make her believe she cannot trust herself or her memory. Beginning to become clear, right? And the modern explanation of gaslighting, that kind of should explain it all. It kind of goes like this. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation that hinges on creating self-doubt. So this is from the particular paper that I read. I think of gaslighting as trying to associate someone with the label crazy. It says Paige Sweet. Paige Sweet. What a name. An assistant professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. Okay. Gaslighting in relationships and in the workplace. It's to make people feel unstable, irrational, and not credible. Gaslighting involves an imbalance of power between the abuser and the person they're gaslighting. The most distinctive feature of gaslighting is that it's not enough for the gaslighter to control his victim or to have things go their way. It's essential that the victim must come to agree. Interesting. And now, that's what I mean. It seems to sort of explain quite an awful lot of things that are happening very well right now. The relationship between the media, the relationship between the state, lobby groups, multinational companies with influence, technocratic institutions and platforms, and their degree of influence over the thinking of everyday people. I mean, what we just went through with lockdown, for example, is a very good example of gaslighting. And so this is what brings me roundabout to this presidential debate. Now, I watched it, so you don't have to. And now you're being told Biden is of sound mind, that you didn't actually see what you saw. This is gaslighting, right? This is exactly what gaslighting is. He's clearly not of sound mind, and having had and have family members with Alzheimer's and dementia, it's a terrible thing. Shame on everyone involved. But this political duopoly run by septuagenarians and octogenarians, they simply don't want to relinquish a goddamn thing to anyone. It strikes me that all their talk of, draining the swamp and Washington is broken, all this kind of stuff, is just sort of play acting. It's just sort of acting up for people to feel like there's, they're in the midst of this terrible industrial and moral crisis. But yet they're just siphoning off money as they always did. They're just making their donors rich. They're just paying off their lobby groups, and they're paying off their shareholders. They're just being even more brazen with it. But they're telling you, well, the system is broken. There's nothing we can do about it. But like I said, these septuagenarians and octogenarians, that's people in their 70s and 80s, and they just don't want to relinquish a goddamn thing. RFK, I quite liked Andrew Yang. He caught my eye the previous time around. But, in the movie Weekend at Bernie's, which you've probably heard in reference to Biden many, many times, if I haven't watched it since I was about 14 or something, but I don't think it's too hard to remember the plot. In that plot, I think two teenage friends visit an uncle for the weekend and have a very big party, but their uncle dies during the party weekend, and they kind of take him out on a jet ski. They sort of parade him round, just going, oh, he's too drunk, he's this, whatever. Which reminds me of, wasn't it somewhere in Brazil where some woman took her just newly deceased uncle or grandfather to try and sign some check in the bank, saying that he was just a little bit drugged out of it. Well, anyway. But anyway, do I need to explain the plot of Weekend at Bernie's? Yes, I'm trying to somehow shoehorn the Death of Stalin and Weekend at Bernie's into the same podcast. But maybe for any younger listeners, I might have. I really don't know what you're doing listening to this podcast. But I think you more or less saw that in this presidential debate. And if you think about it, if you listen to my podcast, Nazis on Speed, good title, right? You got to give me that. That's a catchy title. Which was all about just basically how fueled up on amphetamine all of those guys were back in the 30s. Don't forget, at that time they were in their 30s and 40s. Biden is like 80, 81 or 82 or something. The amount of drugs that they must be on, they have to be on. They have to be up to the eyeballs to try and get them to, to try and click into some kind of gear. And even then, it didn't really work. But you more or less saw this in the presidential debate. And the sight of the pair of these men squabbling over their golf handicaps. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, he didn't really. I think that's just somehow part of the myth. But it just perfectly summed up where the world is right now. These two men in various states of decline and, whatever else you may say about them, arguing about their golf handicaps. And then this week, because, I'm not exactly on time with my observation of the presidential debate, the Democrats circled their wagons and said, you didn't see what you saw. He just had a bad night. Everything is fine. But we did see it. In fact, I watched almost all of it, like I said, so you don't have to. You can just take my opinion as verbatim. Take it as veritas. You don't need to watch it. But you've probably seen lots of clips of it popping up in your reels. If you're one way politically inclined, you've seen all the stuff, which is Biden just trailing off into the middle of nowhere, talking about all sorts of different things. And if you're from another side, I'm not sure. Because it seems like even the most hardy propagandists have had to kind of grudgingly admit, this didn't really go well. Now, before this podcast, I decided to go back and have a little look at Nixon and Kennedy debating. I even took a look at Reagan and Jimmy Carter debating. And I would recommend, to really put things into perspective, go back and just watch some of those debates. Watch how they speak, and then consider the other two squabbling about their golf handicap. It really puts the state of the modern world into a very stark perspective. Like I said, Biden staring at the middle distance, unable to finish a sentence. Trump just bullshitting all the time. I mean, of course you know that. However, I have seen people on one side say, everything, Trump said was fact-checked to be incorrect and this, that, and you're going to go, well, that would mean everything Biden said should be fact-checked to be incorrect because, he said no American soldiers had died and this, that, the other. Now, I think he said that out of the state of his mental decay, but it still doesn't not make it also a lie. Stay back in your box, Mr. Averill. You don't know anything about American politics. Yes, anyway, look, it's fine. We'll talk about Man of War next week. It's okay. But go back and take a look at some of the other presidential debates. And it really puts this one into stark perspective. If you really want something, take a look at Labour leader Neil Kinnock, who for some reason I liked when I was a kid, speaking in the 80s. Wow, damn. Because this is the man that Biden actually copied entire speeches from. He got into trouble for, plagiarizing. And the speeches he plagiarized were speeches by Neil Kinnock, who was the leader of the Labour Party in the 1980s. And hate her or love her, you can watch Thatcher at the time. That's when they were pitted against each other. Two more different people you could not imagine, but also great orators, politicians, statesmen, stateswomen, whatever you want to say. Of course, as Lemmy says, all politicians are liars. Fuck them, right? Of course, but contrast and compare. It's not even the same sport what this presidential debate was compared to the ones from the 70s and 80s. Or, as I said, just go and take a look. You don't even need to watch more than a couple of minutes to go, oh, right. Yeah, I see your point. Of course, if you're a bit more Machiavellian about it, Niccolò Machiavelli, still worth reading, The Prince, which is, of course, the Diamond Head song, The Prince. I think it's written in 1550, I think 1530, something like this. Really interesting treatise on the sort of, it's where the word Machiavellian comes from. It's about, political jostling and jousting and the sort of clever ways of manipulating power in these small Italian city-states. Anyway, to be Machiavellian about it, the Democrat National Congress stood Biden up there in order for this to happen, you would say. So they had a proper reason to take him off the ballot. And in a way, you almost more hope that this is true than the rank, I suppose, incompetence and what is essentially senior abuse that is allowing him to stand again. Because don't forget, there's 4 more years of this ahead of this. Doesn't it feel a little bit Soviet? A little bit Soviet? Good band, actually, Soviet. But feels all a little bit Soviet. Oh, feels like you're being gaslit. If you take the movie, I've talked about it before, Bitter Lake by the very great Adam Curtis. There's one point in it which is about the invasion of Afghanistan and the manipulation of the propaganda surrounding it. But I'm pretty sure it's either in that or one of his other movies. You have Putin's young advisor, I think who studied drama or something like this. Some people will know his name. And he's just basically explaining to the camera. It might not be in that movie. I'm not really too sure. But he's explaining to the camera, we own everything. We own the right-wing thugs we bring out for one demonstration. We own the left-wing, like the Pride Parade people as well. And sometimes we bring them out at the same time. They fight each other. But we fund and manipulate both. You will never know if Putin is actually in that hospital in Crimea or it's a set. You'll never know if we filmed this several years ago or it's happening right now live. And that's the whole point, is that the public know that he knows that they know. And everyone is in on the idea that it's a form of psychodrama, which it's a kind of performative theatre, which so much of modern politics seems to be. Is he there? Is he not really there? And soon, of course, with AI, you're not going to be able to tell. And so we've been gaslit, and it all feels a bit Soviet to me. You did not see what you saw. Yet, with AI, both sides could have actually faked their candidates and shown them as competent and of sound mind, which I think is going to happen. It has to happen, right? Because if Biden has to go another 4 years, then you can expect that in your future, and the systems behind him possibly deferring to the decision-making of AI. Ho, we're in for a bumpy ride, my friends. The Death of Stalin versus Weekend at Bernie's. I think most of you will probably end up watching, well, I shouldn't presume. I would recommend The Death of Stalin. Go and take a look. And if you think I'm just talking trite nonsense, that's also fine. You might be right. Next week, we'll talk about what is the greatest Manowar album. I mean, you know the answer is Into Glory Ride already, but let's get into that. All right, my friends, Agitators Anonymous, over and out. I'm just a singer in a heavy metal band. I ain't no historian. I ain't no politician. So don't take it all that seriously. Planet Satan, over and out.